Well, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to everyone to this event. Where I am today, it's cold and there's snow on the ground, but I'm sure that the conversations we're going to have are going to warm us all up and be a really exciting moment in what we might do in relation to children and young people. The BERA Presidential Roundtable events are our high-profile events, and we select researchers with an international reputation in the topic of the Roundtable. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to welcome Professor Jane Hurry, who I have the pleasure of working with at the Institute of Education in London, and the wonderful team of people she has selected today to help us in this vital task of considering children's well-being. The roundtables the planning for these started 6 months to a year ago, and we had 3 that we wanted to be in the first tranche. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and so BERA's events as a whole were challenged, and I want to pay huge tribute to the BERA staff who are behind the scenes at this event for the wonderful work they've done in getting it ready, but also in learning a whole set of new expertise to enable BERA to do its work. The one on the roundtable on children's well-being was always one of the ones that we wanted to do, and who could have predicted that children's mental health and well-being would be so prominent in public discourse as a result of the issues that the pandemic has brought, and not least, of course, in relation to education and how children are accessing education. But broader than that, there's a lasting issue to do with well-being, and one aspect for me is the role of the teacher and the role of the educator and the role of other professional services in relation to children. And teachers, of course, naturally conceive their work in certain ways. And so, therefore, the place of supporting children's well-being needs exploration in terms of professional roles, as well as in terms of what's most likely to be effective. One of the main changes that I've brought to the structure of the presidential roundtables, which have been going for some years now, is I've brought a sharper focus on the links between research, policy, and practice. And our aim is to establish guidance and related materials to provide a lasting resource for researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. And we will revisit these from time to time as the evidence base moves on. So, without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Jane, and I'm really excited to hear the event.
Hi, folks. This is Jane Hurry speaking, and like Dom, I'm really pleased to be hosting this event today, to think about to give us a bit of time to step back and converse together from the different perspectives on how we might go forward in terms of thinking about well-being and mental health in schools. And what I would like to achieve today is I'd like for us to have a debate from the different perspectives on the practical ways forward to address student well-being and mental health in schools. So I guess one of the things that has become even more obvious to me as I've been preparing for this event is that we tend to be a bit siloed in the ways that we approach these mental health and well-being in schools. And I think there needs to be a greater coming together. So I'd like us to have a discussion across the disciplines here. I'd like us to be able to come to some conclusions at the end, and I'd like to be able to capture those conclusions and drive them forward in research, policy, and practice. I'm going to give you a very short introduction before I hand over to our various speakers and discussants. But what I'm teeing you up for is that at the end, we're going to revisit what your decisions have been at the end of this presentation. So just to remind you from the position paper what we propose. We propose that there should be a focus on wellbeing and mental health in schools, that it should include supporting the child, so that's the fix the child part. It should include a whole school approach, so that's looking at the environment. There should be greater interaction than there is now between education and mental health practitioners, a closer exchange, knowledge exchange. There should be a more explicit focus on school performance. So we've got a lot of focus on mental health and wellbeing symptoms, but how about school performance? And finally, the initial teacher training and continuing professional development should be thought about a lot more. And in order to achieve these, thinking about these proposals, I think that the folk we've got here today are going to take us forward very well. Not only do we have 3 outstanding speakers that I'm going to introduce in a minute, we've also got 2 outstanding discussants, and the audience is made up of a wide range of folks with expertise in different areas, ranging from initial teacher education, continuing to professional development, and research. Okay, so I'm now going to just introduce the speakers. Okay, so we've got the presenters will run in this order. So we've got Professor Jess Dayton, who is a professor of mental health and wellbeing at UCL, and she's also the Director of Innovation and Evaluation and Dissemination at the Anna Freud Centre, and has done lots of work in this area. We've got Professor Chris Bonnell, who's a Professor of Public Health Sociology at Institute of Health at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he's again done much very useful research in this area that he's going to talk about. And so I'm seeing Jess as presenting a little bit from the health side really, and Chris maybe from the more the school side. So well, we'll see how that works out, and maybe Jess may be thinking more about addressing individuals, and Chris addressing more environment, so the fixing of the school side of it we'll see. And Catherine Carroll is a great person who goes across both school space and research space. So she's done research in this area, but she's also works closely with teachers. She's been a teacher herself, she does teacher training, and she works very closely with teachers. So that's a nice tie-in. And I want to also introduce you to our discussants. So we've got Matthew Hopkinson from the Department for Education, and he holds the brief, the poor man, for both physical and mental health and well-being of pupils. So he's extremely pressed at the moment. So very grateful to you for coming here today, Matthew. And Anne Keane-Mayer is currently the head of Ernest Bevin College. Anne has many years of experience as a head teacher, moving across in different areas. She's a bit of a troubleshooter, I think we might say, and so she's got a particular interest at the moment in thinking about well-being and mental health, and so their perspectives are going to be extremely valuable in interrogating what the researchers are offering. Okay, so I'd like to move right on. We should be moving on now to introducing Jess Dayton, who's going to give us her presentation, which will then be open, first of all, to discussants from the panel and then from the audience. And please, audience, can you ask questions, because we're excited to hear all the different perspectives.
Thanks so much, Jane. Great. It's really nice to be here, and it always feels a little bit strange talking to an audience that you can't see, but yeah, really welcome the opportunity to talk to you all. I think I probably am going to be in the territory that Jane anticipated to some degree, but I will probably be focusing more on sort of mental health side of things than well-being for this particular talk. I'm going to think a bit about what we know at the moment about children and young people's mental health, particularly the level of need at the moment, especially in the last year where things have changed quite a bit. I want to think about schools as a context really for universal prevention of mental health problems and early intervention for that matter. And sort of as I go along, I'm going to think a bit about risk and protective factors, and then just some reflections based on the kind of themes of the day really. So just starting right from the beginning, really, I feel like as I'm the first on, I should lay some foundational background, some of which I'm sure will be very familiar to some of you. For a long time, we didn't have any up-to-date sort of prevalence data on children and young people's mental health. So we referred back to data from, sort of 8 years ago, where we would say around 1 in 10 children and young people would experience mental health problems at any one time. I think we got so ingrained in saying that sometimes we still say it now, even though the evidence has been updated a bit. And I always found it quite helpful to translate that into what does that look like as a class of young people. So in a class of 30, we're talking about round about 3 children, 3 pupils. And it's quite easy to get stuck with the mean, the average number. And I think in some classes that might be the case, but we also have to remember, of course, that there's a number of factors that do increase the likelihood that children experience mental health problems. This is just a very small list. So economic pressures we know are associated, high levels of family conflict, living in unsafe neighbourhoods, having special educational needs, parents having mental health problems, also low self-esteem, sort of poor emotion regulation. There's a whole range of factors, and some of those, particularly the economic factors and things like special educational needs, we know can concentrate quite high. They can cluster in sort of geographical areas or within schools. So where those things are more common, obviously the mental health problems are more likely to be more common as well, and the makeup of the class might look quite different. So that was the picture previously. We were fortunate to have an updated prevalence study in 2017 that reported the year after, and that updated the picture a bit, which suggested essentially it was more like 4 in a class of 30 were experiencing mental health problems at that point. So some increase in that period of time. And we also got a little bit more insight into where those young people who are experiencing mental health problems go for support. So around 1 in 4 had contact with specialist mental health services, but many more were seeking some kind of support from teachers. I think that's really important to bear in mind and probably becomes relevant later on. But they were very likely to seek help from teachers. And in fact, when we look at differences between schools, having control for all those factors I talked about before, those demographic factors that we know can increase risks of mental health problems. If we look at the schools where children have better mental health outcomes, quite often their experience of connection with teachers in school can be more positive as well. So that's something else to think about. So that was a fairly recent picture that we had, and we felt quite pleased that we felt like we knew more about recent levels of mental health problems. But of course, that was pre-coronavirus. And we've had reports from various channels that life has been very challenging for children and young people in the last year. So we did have an update of these studies, which were all carried out by NHS Digital, which reported on data from July. So sort of right in the middle of the pandemic and very close to sort of lockdown period. And what we saw there was it was more like sort of 5 in a class of 30 that might be experiencing mental health problems. So it really had increased. And we've also, at the evidence-based practice unit where I'm director, we've been trying to synthesize evidence that's emerging in the last year about what the experience has been for children and young people, what the impact has been on their mental health problems, just drawing on global research really. And what we see is an increase in both instances of mental health problems, mental disorder, if you like, as this study sort of speaks to, but we also see increases in sort of general distress. So children and young people, I would say, having quite normal responses to a highly unusual set of circumstances. So feelings of threat and anxiety, academic worries about time lost at school and what that means for their academic attainment, feelings of isolation, obviously for those who've experienced loss or illness and associated sort of trauma and grief, And for those who were already accessing mental health services or other services, a sense that the support around them had dropped off. So really quite challenging periods of time. So each of those studies help increase our understanding of what the need is in children and young people, but they're all snapshots of very specific periods in time. So I just wanted to step out a bit broader for a minute to think sort of more broadly about mental health challenges. And to warm us up, I thought I'd do this in the form of a bit of a quiz question. So on this screen here, I have spent probably more time than I ought to have getting a page of 100 little people, and 17 of them are shaded. So that's 17% of the people on this slide are shaded. So my question is, what do you think that 17% represents? So you should be able to do a little poll here. So the first option is 17% experience a mental health problem during adolescence. Is it 17% have continuing mental health problems across the life course? 17% don't experience mental health problems ever, or 17% have positive well-being in spite of having mental health problems. So if you can just click your options, I think it might take a little while to update, so I'll just pause while that chugs away. Okay, I think that might have finished. I'm not sure if it updates as it goes. Oh no, it's still updating. I'll give it another little while. It's like watching a horse race or something. Okay, let's give it a few more seconds. It stayed fairly consistent, but it looks like things have evened up a little bit as we've gone along. So I would say that the majority of you got the right answer, which is that around 17% of people don't experience a mental health problem at any point in their life course. So I'll just say a little bit more about that. So this is based on a study from 2017, which was carried out in New Zealand. And they were interested to see what, I should backtrack a bit. So it's a longitudinal study where they've looked at people across their life course from sort of mid-childhood through to much later adulthood. And they were interested to see at each of the sweeps that they collected data, they had survey data which would indicate those scoring above a sort of clinical inverted commas threshold on a measure that would indicate they had a diagnosable mental disorder. So they looked to see how many of those people didn't have a mental disorder any sweep of time, and it was only 17%. And in fact, we've just looked at this with UK data in the Millennium Cohort Study, just interested to see what happens throughout childhood. So starting right from very early childhood through to mid-adolescence. And even in that sort of quite short period of time, enduring mental health, which is what we call it when people haven't experienced any mental health problems at all, enduring mental health is actually less than 50% of the population, even by the age of 15. So the reason I raise it is I think it's a really helpful and normalizing point to make. So I think we quite often think of mental health problems as a rarity. And that slightly skews the way we talk about them. And I think if we can get into the habit of talking to young people about mental health problems like this, where we say, you probably will encounter one at some point in your lifetime, you will encounter struggles that make it hard to manage your mental health. That's a helpful message because one, it tells us it's the norm. So it's not unusual, so it's destigmatizing, but it also tells us it makes sense to equip ourselves with the skills and the support structures around us that make it more likely that we can manage in those conditions. So with that sort of backdrop in mind, I suppose where I want to move to is thinking about, with all that in mind, knowing what the level of difficulties are, knowing what are the factors that contribute to a greater likelihood of experiencing mental health problems. How do we support young people to recognise that mental health is important, it's something they're going to need to manage actively, but also to help them cope with experiences like in the last year, where there will be instances or experiences that threaten their mental health, and how do we create environments that hold and support them in ways that are sort of useful and they're able to draw on while they're struggling. Oh, sorry, I've got a slight delay on my buttons. So I think schools are a good starting point for many reasons. The obvious is schools are a fairly universal access point for prevention and early intervention of all varieties. This is why often we have vaccination programs in schools, etc. As a public health measure, it makes sense to put things into schools. But as I said earlier, young people are actually very minded to turn to adults in school for support when they need it. And we know that positive wellbeing in childhood predicts good outcomes in later life. So in terms of adaptation, if that's what we're thinking about the school system as being adaptation to later life, adaptation to the world of work, then we know these factors are important. And we also have fairly good evidence that interventions in school improve mental health. So when I say fairly good, what I mean is there's a lot of research out there, but a lot of it is fairly poor quality. So trying to extract the sort of messages from that can be a little bit unclear. But we did a bit of evidence synthesis last year for Public Health England, trying to look at universal prevention programs for mental health and well-being. And we found a number of common elements about these kind of programs that were embedded, often in schools. They tended to be group or class-based activities. They tended to be a discrete number of sessions and worked on sort of skills basis. So building social and emotional skills, for example, or emotion management skills. Many of them had principles of cognitive behavioural therapy behind them. And it sounds obvious, but lots of them made real active steps to try and engage young people. So it wasn't just taught, but often it involved discussion or interaction or role play. So that's a sense of the kind of things that emerge. But actually, even with some of the really promising programmes, the evidence is a bit contradictory. Sometimes they're found to be effective, other times studies find that they aren't. And even if we do have evidence-based approaches, often they're not adopted in schools. So that's a real challenge. These graphs here are just referring to some work we did quite some time ago now, but we were interested to ask schools about to what extent do they draw on evidence-based approaches where they know that there's evidence previously that these approaches have been tried and tested empirically and been found to work. And actually, there was a bit of an even split really between schools selecting something like that versus things that they knew locally. They were borrowing practice from other schools where they'd felt that their sort of schools in their local area had felt something had really worked. So there's a real challenge there in terms of how we make sure that what's selected is evidence-based. But also there's a challenge of adaptation as well, where we find that even when things are brought in that are evidence-based, often they're adapted quite a lot. And the second graph that I included there was we asked them to what degree do they stick to a set plan of working completely, or how much do they adapt it, or how much do they just completely start from scratch? And essentially, no one adhered to a set plan of working from those that we asked. And I think there's probably good reasons for that. Not all interventions are fit for all contexts. They're not sort of designed with a particular school context in mind, or they may have come from another country where the school environment's quite different. But sometimes things do just get adapted because people like to be creative, which is natural tendency, I suppose. But the challenge then is that we don't really know whether the intervention would have been effective because it's been changed too much. And another challenge that we have is often things are embedded for a short period of time, but they don't really stick. So they're not genuinely embedded. They're just sort of a bit of a sticking plaster that holds for a short period of time. So I'm conscious of time, but I am just going to give a quick example of something we're doing that sort of speaks to that space, I suppose, which is funded by the Department for Education, which is 2 trials which are trying to tackle some of these challenges. So the first trial is about taking tried and tested interventions that have been found to work in other countries, but being mindful that because things don't always work in different contexts, that they should be trialed and slightly adapted to fit the UK context. And those 2 approaches are one's from Sweden and one's from Canada. And then the other trial is much more about using what schools have used sort of traditionally, the sorts of practice they borrow from each other or embed because they think it's sort of helpful, but they don't necessarily have an evidence base, and seeing whether we could sort of actually put some kind of structure and actually provide that evidence base for whether those things really do work. So I won't go into full details, but the interventions that have been tried and tested before are described there. So the one from Sweden is called YAM, Youth Aware of Mental Health, and the one from Canada is called The Guide. So they both have evidence elsewhere, and we're trying them out in UK schools. And for Inspire, 2 of these, relaxation and mindfulness, just about 5-minute sessions every day. Can we drip feed good practices throughout school life, really, and see if that's effective in any way? And also, can we develop some knowledge of, which is strategies for safety and wellbeing, can we develop some knowledge and awareness that will allow us to sort of equip children with some mental health literacy that will stand in a good stead later. So those are just some examples. We're still in the middle of trialing those, but what we're finding out is that when we try and translate interventions from elsewhere, some of the cultural differences, even between, say, Canada and the UK, can really jar, and some adaptation is needed. The school context, even within the UK, are highly variable, which I'm sure everybody joining today would be aware of. Adaptation definitely happens, even if we think we've made adaptations to make something fit the UK context, for example. Schools do still want to adapt things further. When things have been embedded for a short period of time, actually keeping them going is highly challenging and highly variable across different schools. And one of the things that feeds into that is what else is happening in the school. So where interventions are happening and there's no other mental health support or no ethos in the school for that, that's much more of a challenge. So I won't go into this in detail, but what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that we spend a lot of our time thinking about mental health interventions as the answer, but they really are the tip of the iceberg. And so I've just given some examples here of some other elements that really need to be there in the school context for these interventions to work best, but also to have the most positive effects on children's mental health and well-being. So models of identifying need, for example, knowing who it is that might need additional support, allowing young people a voice to say what they think the challenges are, thinking about the wider system that this kind of intervention fits within, what are the supports available, are just a few examples. So my own reflections then are that I still think, even though the evidence is equivocal in some instances, we should be starting with evidence-based interventions because that's the best starting point. I can't think of a good argument for starting elsewhere. We need to adapt sometimes, but we need to do that with caution. And if we do adapt, we need to evaluate in situ to understand what those changes have meant, really. But most importantly, we need to build interventions into a wider system of support and a wider ethos of mental health and well-being within schools. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. That was so now. Opening first of all for discussion to our 2 discussants, Matthew, the policy man, and Anne, the teacher person. But please, people in the audience, can you also be posing your questions as well, typing them in so that we can pick those up. Okay, so Matthew and Anne.
Do you want me to go first, just with a few sort of observations off the back of Jess's presentation? I'm trying to resist the temptation to offload all of my observations off the back of one presentation, which is going to be quite difficult. But I do think, you know, I mean, a lot of the stuff that Jess is talking about, we recognise, and as Jess pointed out, actually the randomised controlled trials is something that DFE was keen to set up, responding to sort of requests from teachers to say, to understand what works, and that sort of sense that people were trying stuff, but against a background of not really knowing what worked within a school environment in this country. So I think the evidence-based position is really important. I think sometimes I sort of balk a bit at this idea that schools are this great public health opportunity, in terms of as if it was something that should be lumped on top of what they do on a day-to-day basis. And so I think one of the things that we're keen to sort of draw out and make sure is understood is that and as Jess said, it's the bit below, the importance of the bit below the surface of that sort of iceberg, I think, in terms of the things that schools do on a regular basis, the responsibilities they have in terms of what they teach in the curriculum, how they manage behaviour, how they sort of identify needs and help further support through the SEND processes, and how they respond in a safeguarding way. Mental health runs throughout those sorts of things, and it is what they do, and it's recognising how that works, which I think is really important. And I'll just pause there for now and let Anne come in.
Great.
Hello. I know you can hear me, but I do apologise. My camera is refusing to open, so I'll carry on and try and fix it in a moment. I think the thing I was struck by when I was listening to this was how differently I might have responded, thinking about the different schools that I have worked in. And the point about context, I think, is very, very real. Certainly coming from a school in kind of rural Wiltshire, which is a garrison town, to a school like Ernest Bevan, which is 93% BAME. It's a boys' school. It's in Tooting and Balham. It is very different. I think what COVID has done, though, is it's provided an incentive for us all to really address some of the issues. And I suppose what I think is, as a head teacher, oh gosh, I failed to do that beforehand, that I've only done it in response to this. And what we felt that we were allowed to do as a result of the COVID situation was really allow us time to talk to the children about their experiences during lockdown. So we went through a process where we actually interviewed every single child, and the teachers that interviewed them were equally struck by how much that made a difference to their relationships, and talking to them about lockdown, talking about how that had affected them. And two things came out of that. One was that we were kind of surprised at how remarkably strong the children had been through this period. The lovely thing from our point of view was also how glad they were to be back in school. And I think if we'd taken a poll at that moment, we might have felt that we were doing an absolutely great job, because all the kids were so desperate to come back. Some of the other aspects, though, of mental health, I think the iceberg is absolutely true. I think that schools are very pressurised by the circumstances in which they find themselves. So we're an RI school, and you can imagine what that means to its context in terms of the priorities that the school is pursuing. The other thing about particularly wellbeing and mental health is that it tends to be a bit of a drip process rather than a systemic and sustained process within the school. And that I think that one of the things that maybe the COVID situation has done is make us think more clearly that we should be doing that it should be much more part and parcel of everything we're doing in school, and that maybe we've been going at things the wrong way round. We've been attempting to sort out things like assessment and the classroom and how we actually organise the children, whereas actually the classroom might become a much more powerful place for learning if we were addressing some of these other aspects like mental health and like wellbeing in a much more cohesive manner. And I think it is that lack of cohesion in the way that we address some of this. Somebody spoke about schools being very siloed, and that's absolutely true. Schools that have tend to have two types of teacher in them. The teacher who's really committed to their subject, and that's what they deliver, that's what they come to school each day for. And then the pastoral area of the school, which care about apparently, all of those other aspects of school. And there is a hierarchy, I think, in some of that. Shall I stop there?
That's great. Thank you both very much. And I think we can see there's already some sort of challenges there that are coming up. Now, what I'd like to do now is see some of the questions from the audience.
My video won't come on.
Okay, right. Oh, this is challenging to, sorry. I've enlarged my screen. My glasses didn't cope with that. Okay, so here we've got some questions for all the panel. So both Matthew and Anne, but the speakers as well. Do you think we focus too much on reactivity, symptom-related policies rather than looking at the root causes of the spike? Anybody? Yeah, Jess.
I'm happy to have a first go. I do worry that, yes, I mean, as much like with the response, I think the problem, we quite often look at the tip of the iceberg where I am slightly concerned that we assume sometimes that it takes a mental health intervention to solve a mental health problem. And I think when we look at what's changed in that period between those surveys, yes, we can say social media, but we could also say increased academic pressures. We could say, you know, a long period of austerity. But we can also see changes to the school environment, can't we? I mean, I think there was a great study from IOE saying on average that the amount of break time in schools has reduced by 45 minutes or even more over the last 10 years. And, you know, we do get reports from Ofsted and others about narrowing of the curriculum and things. So I do think that really we need to almost think from building from the bottom up for wellbeing in schools, that actually those things where we're allowing young people who don't achieve in, you know, the English, math, science, but are brilliant football players or great at drama, you know, cutting those things actually erodes well-being. Less downtime erodes well-being. So I do think there's sort of some further upstream thinking that needs to be had alongside these other bits. I'm not saying there's not a role for both.
Very interesting point, Jess. And I think, you know, for us all, see, was in a sense what Jess is saying now is, oh, well, and I quite agree with her. And I think maybe the people that have spoken before you agree with her, that there's a lot going on in schools that might be used to support well-being and mental health. But if we contrast what the sort of evidence base that we're talking about, that, you know, I presented in the position paper and Jess has talked about now, it bears little resemblance in a way to that. Anyway, let's have a look at the next question. I did see a question from Ed, who is actually, I will come to Ellie too. I'll just pick up Ed just because Jess mentioned break time, and Ed Baines is one of the guys that's been doing that research. Are there simpler, so Ed's question, are there some simple ways to support well-being by readjusting what schools do normally day to day before we begin to consider changing what schools do by asking them to undertake costly and often poorly implemented interventions? So that kind of really goes right on from what we've just raised. What anybody got any comments about that from the discussants and speakers?
Hi Jane, it's Catherine.
Catherine, yes.
Catherine here. Again, my video is not going on, but if you can hear me there, I think just one simple idea that actually came up from a governor's meeting that we were in last night, and in the interest of transparency, Anne and I are in the same school. But what we've heard back was just the young people in their bubbles and not moving around the building at the end of every 45 minutes to 1 hour, which often entails, you know, we talked about the year 7 who has to find their way through the year 9, 10 and 11. And that in itself can be a challenge for some young people. And they arrive, so in a sense, we were talking about teachers, the benefits of teachers moving more around the school rather than the young people.
The young people like not moving around, is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think we found that the feedback so far, I mean, you have to balance it, but actually it's proved, it's brought, and obviously Anne will say more, but certainly to our setting, but I've also heard it for other schools, that there's a calm and a peacefulness in schools that hasn't perhaps existed as much before as in some schools, because we just don't have 1,000 young people moving when a bell goes.
Interesting, yes. And so that's just another tiny little example of, and where is the evidence for all of this? And it's not that it's not important, but it's I suppose what I'm throwing out to you guys is that challenge between what makes sense and what the evidence is. Can we just have a peep at any other person on the panel want to comment on that?
Go on, sorry.
No, go on, Anne.
I was just thinking that schools don't know what they don't know, and I suppose COVID has taught us a load of things that we didn't know, and we're now having to deal with that. We expected some things to be the case, and we planned for them. So we expected that putting our lads, my bouncy lads, in a room for 4 hours was going to be absolutely terrible. We expected that they would hate it and we'd be kind of, running wild almost whenever they were let out. That has not been the case. So we're having to rethink. We regrouped all of our pupils so that we made sure that the groupings, the bubbles that they were in, were very balanced. And that has had quite a dramatic impact. But some subjects, as you can imagine, don't like it because it's meant that, mathematics is not taught in strictly hierarchical sets. But from a point of view of a school and the order of the school and the children's enjoyment, we've had to rethink again whether our curriculum is right. And I think that what this has done is made us think about our curriculum in a much broader sense, and to learn. We're having to learn from this experience as to whether actually we need to readjust the curriculum for children, and accept that maybe it may not be as easy and as accommodating to teachers. And then we have to persuade teachers that that's worth it in the longer term.
Oh, thank you very much. Sorry, I was just got the cleaners downstairs. I'm going to let Matthew if you wanted to say something very quickly, Matthew.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on this, that Anne and Kath were drawing out how schools are rethinking about what they do. But for me, it's how the sort of COVID experience has thrown this broader setup. Schools are thinking holistically about, actually, this isn't just about how can we support well-being, although that has been but it's also how do we teach effectively in a sort of new environment? How do we sort of get that? How do we make sure that behaviour is maintained within this environment? It's not three things acting that are sometimes seen as acting sort of against each other or as a trade-off. It's actually how you bring that back round, and that comes back to the sort of previous point about not just focusing on interventions. And it also, I think, picks up the point for the question from Ellie Costello about that sort of, what about the children who thrived without the pressure of the school environment? Actually, you've got schools thinking about how do you make that environment inclusive, that it's got the good behaviour, it's got the academic support, but it's something which can, was what we're doing working, and how do we get that gets a real sort of bonus? It hits all of the things that schools do, and that's what I meant earlier on about how actually mental health runs throughout these sort of jobs that schools always had, and it's an interesting rethink from that perspective.
Absolutely, and I think also, guys, it's making a point for us that we were debating about whether you need to fix the environment, and we're just seeing from these examples actually that the environment was making a difference to kids, actually in unexpected ways that we didn't know. So we've got that stuff here. I'm just going to see, just can I have one flip to the question now? We need to be moving on, but I wanted to ask Ellie Costello because her question was very light, her or his. What evidence is there which captures those children who thrived in lockdown without the anxiety and pressure around school and attendance, and or accessing the school environment, social or academic pressures? Okay.
So maybe I can start from the research perspective, because we have been trying to pull together the evidence, and just say on the Anna Freud website, we have these emerging evidence briefings on the impact of coronavirus on children and young people's mental health. If anyone wants to find it, I'll see if I can share the link somehow. it does seem really patchy. So there were studies. There was a study in Bristol highlighting that some young people, their well-being vastly improved actually, or at least significantly improved during lockdown, because they were finding their own way of doing things, and some of the pressures were being removed. And we had sort of more anecdotal reports from charities suggesting that some of those who were young carers, for example, were finding it easier to not have to juggle between school and home, and some who were being bullied or for other reasons found the school environment challenging actually did do quite well. And I think that's something, another reason we do feel like we're coming back to schools a bit blindfolded, because I keep using the analogy of we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. So some people have actually had real positives from this period. Others have found it cripplingly challenging, and it's really quite difficult to predict in some senses which young people will have experienced what. But I think learning from both sides is really important.
Great. I'm going to, we could talk on this the whole time. I'm going to push us on now though, because we want to hear from Chris Bonnell, the next speaker.
Okay, hello. Could you turn my video on? Okay, lovely. Hello, so yeah, I'm Chris Bonnell from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm going to talk about how promoting changing school environments can promote mental health and well-being. Next slide, please. So the traditional approach to promoting mental health, as in physical health in schools, is to focus on health lessons, curricula in the classroom. And there is some evidence that this can be effective in promoting mental and physical health. For example, evidence showing that some social and emotional skills curriculums can improve mental health outcomes. And there's also evidence that both social and emotional skills education, but also school-based mental health services can also have positive impacts on educational attainment. Next slide, please. But this isn't the only way to promote mental and physical health in schools. There's increasing evidence that schools can promote health and well-being through modifying their wider school environment, not just from delivering lessons in classrooms. Now, the Cochrane collaboration is a collaboration that do systematic reviews of health interventions. And we did a Cochrane review of what are called health promoting schools interventions. And this is a term used by the World Health Organization to refer to interventions that have a curriculum component in schools. They also have a wider school environment component, and then they have also a community or parental component. So to be included in this review, studies had to be evaluations of this kind of intervention in primary or secondary schools, and to use randomized controlled trials. And the review found that pooling the evidence across studies, these interventions were effective in reducing bullying, reducing smoking, obesity, and promoting healthy eating. But there were very few studies at that stage, which was 2014, looking at the effects on promoting mental health. Next slide, please. Now, as well as evidence from randomized controlled trials or other evaluations of interventions, there's also evidence from just observational studies looking at the differences in health outcomes between schools. And this is quite a useful way to get some sense about what impact the wider school environment can have on health outcomes. Now, there's quite good evidence that schools do vary in students' rates of smoking, drinking, drug use, and violence. And some evidence this is partly explained by differences in those schools in the extent to which they're successful engaging students, both in academic learning, but also as being members of the school community. So there's evidence that schools with better belonging and better attainment also have lower rates of these negative health outcomes. But there's less evidence that that is the case for schools. It seems that the evidence suggests that rates of mental health problems don't vary that much between schools once you take into account differences in student composition. This is still an evolving evidence base, but that's what the evidence currently says. Next slide, please. So drawing on all this evidence, we developed an intervention, and this was me working with my co-director of the project, Russell Viner, and also working with Stephen Scott, who's in this conference, to develop a new intervention, which was a whole school intervention addressing physical and mental health. It aimed to reduce bullying as its primary outcome, but also to reduce rates of substance use, drugs, alcohol, and smoking, and also improve mental health wellbeing. There were two measures relevant to mental health. There was the SDQ measure, strengths and difficulties, looking at psychological problems, and then the short Warwick-Edinburgh measure of mental wellbeing. And the intervention itself was a 3-year intervention delivered in secondary schools in South East England, and it had 3 components. It trained staff in using restorative practice as a way of dealing with conflict instead of merely punitive responses. Some teachers had in-depth training to run conferences, while other teachers had more basic training to use restorative language and to do circle time in their lessons. There was also a classroom social and emotional health curriculum. And finally, there was an action group. An action group consisted of staff and students across the school, and this action group reviewed data from the baseline survey looking at student needs, and then used this data to inform its overall coordination of the intervention. So this involved, core components that I've already talked about, as well as some additional locally chosen activities that allowed the intervention to be tailored to each school's needs and capacities. And the design of the trial was, it was 40 schools recruited, half went into the intervention and half acted as comparisons and carried on with their normal practice. There was a baseline survey before randomisation when the students were at the end of year 7, and then there were follow-ups at the ends of year 9 and 10. Next slide, please. And so the impacts were positive. The intervention was well implemented in general, apart from the curriculum. And this wasn't, with the benefit of hindsight, a massive surprise. I think the curriculum wasn't all that great. We adapted the curriculum from a previous intervention, the Gatehouse intervention from Australia, which was quite old, and it just didn't really fly in schools. Schools didn't have time to implement the curriculum in their very busy timetable, so they really struggled and often had to deliver it in shorter time. They weren't very impressed with the curriculum, and it wasn't a major part of the intervention. But other aspects of the intervention were much better implemented. And implementation was much more feasible when schools had good capacity, when basically they had a deputy head who was a believer in the programme and really powered its implementation, but also when the intervention felt like it was aligning with existing school culture. In schools that already had a kind of interest in wider student development and had an inclusive ethos, the intervention went down a treat. In schools that were more sort of, for want of a better word, authoritarian academies, it didn't fly because it didn't fit culturally with the ethos of the school. In terms of the benefits, we found no benefits after 2 years, and we found our benefits arising after 3 years, which suggested this intervention took a while to achieve whole school change. But those benefits consisted of reduced bullying victimisation, reduced smoking, alcohol and drug use, and also improvements in mental well-being and psychological functioning, using those measures I talked about, as well as health-related quality of life. Next slide, please. Interestingly, we also found the intervention reduced rates of truancy, and it reduced the amount of time that teachers spent on discipline. We haven't yet looked at educational attainment impacts. There's an independent evaluation currently ongoing, led by the University of Manchester, funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, and they're looking at linked data from the National Pupil Database about education impacts. We found the intervention was highly cost effective, though, in improving health. And we did secondary analyses on looking at the mechanisms of action, and they appear to suggest that the intervention seemed to work in 2 different ways. In high capacity schools that really ran with all the components, the intervention appeared to work by promoting belonging and making students feel like they were part of an inclusive school community. Now, those mechanisms were much less obvious in the more disadvantaged schools, with higher rates of bullying at baseline and less managerial capacity, as measured by the Ofsted ratings. But the intervention still worked in those schools. The intervention seemed to work in all schools, but via different mechanisms. And the intervention worked for all students. The intervention worked for all socioeconomic groups, as well for disadvantaged individual students as more middle-class students. But the intervention did appear to have bigger effects for boys rather than girls. Next slide, please. We're now taking forward further work on this. There's interest in scaling up this intervention from the Welsh Assembly Government, and it's in the process of being accredited by the Blueprints for Positive Youth Development in the US and the Early Intervention Foundation in the UK. And we're also just got funding, Russell and I. with Stephen to do an adaptation of this intervention to draw out its mental health elements and develop a new intervention that's based on this intervention, but is much more focused as mental health as the primary outcome. And in addition to that, we're doing a new randomised controlled trial of a positive choices intervention, which is a whole school sex education intervention. So looking at relationships and sex education, but again, taking a whole school approach. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Chris. I never can seem to manage all these devices. So Chris has sort of pushed us on thinking about the environmental aspects, and I'm going to open that for discussion now. First of all, Matthew and Anne, what are your responses to Chris's presentation about inclusive?
You want to start, Matthew?
Yeah, go on. Just a couple of quick observations on that. I think somebody's raised an issue in a question in the Q&A about the impact of the new relationship, sex and health education curriculum. And I think one of the things that the presentation sort of draws out is that this isn't a new thing for schools, but I do think one of the things that we've been aiming to do by making it compulsory is to look at get schools to look at it and think about sort of trying to raise the sort of raise the standards and raise the impact of it. And I think one of the things that's been drawn out by that previous presentation as well, that, and I think I was trying to imply before, it doesn't stand alone. The sort of idea that we introduce RSHE, people teach about mental health, and that sorts everything out, doesn't work. It's not something that you can sort of come in and say, right, that's an intervention, tick, we're sorted. It does link into the rest of the how the school is being set up. And just to pick up on some of the unanswered questions to the previous thing, that's one of the reasons why we've been looking again in the context of COVID at our approach to setting up training of senior mental health leads. We know in schools, we know from the sort of we know that more and more schools are identifying somebody to lead on mental health, and that they have different roles. And one of the things that the sort of experiences we've gone through COVID and before has taught us, as colleagues have gone out to try and learn some of those lessons and think about how do we sort of do a post-COVID version of that and perhaps adjust our approach to it, is that actually lots of schools where before the priority was people sort of understanding mental health issues and sort of having what colleagues have been referred to as domain knowledge, was one of the priorities for schools, and just understanding what the issues are. The process has been through, and the sort of support over the last couple of years has sort of shifted into how do you do something which, how do you actually embed this across the school, build a whole school approach effectively that runs through curriculum that really involves other teachers in the way that Chris was talking about some of the those sort of aspects, and therefore allows you something which sort of builds and reinforces and doesn't see the dealing with well-being and mental health as being just one bit of the school's responsibility. So I'll just pause there.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I think I'm just going to pop in a point before I move on to hear from Anne. So a question for all of the audience that all of us maybe is thinking about, well, what, Matthew's talking, Chris kind of outlined things in his intervention, different strategies that used within the school, different structures to implement this whole school change. Should that be part of policy thought? Should this be requirements that we have these layers? Anyway, over to you, Anne, please.
This was one that I wasn't quite sure how to respond, because I think that schools tend sometimes to look outside for the explanations of the way in which children operate within the school, particularly around areas like bullying, smoking, substance abuse, that somehow the pressures on children to engage in these things are outside. And it can leave schools feeling a little bit impotent in terms of their power to bring about to bring about improvement and change. So I found this, found this piece of research very interesting, because I think one of the things that schools need to feel is that they can make a difference, that they are really, there is a structure, there is a system, there is something they can operate in practice that will really make a difference. Because I think schools are very willing to engage in things that they believe will make a difference. The thing that concerned me a bit is about who it is that is going to be leading and doing this. So often in schools, it does feel that the people who end up being given these roles are not particularly prepared for it. They're not given the skill base that they maybe would need. So I could see where this was something where research and school practice and certainly school priorities in their practice could make a major difference. But it's a big job, and we know this through the current programme with mental health, between health and schools. It's a very slow rollout, and the amount of, if you like, expert practice that is helping schools to take this forward. And the people then within the school who are trying to take this forward do find it quite difficult. There is no doubt that it needs to be led at the very top. And this needs to be, there has to be this complete commitment, because teachers need the opportunity to learn about these things. And CPD in schools is very fragmented. There's no two ways about it. And I was thinking about how often teachers really get the opportunity to research and follow up on research, and maintain that enthusiasm and excitement, I suppose, in developing their practice. And looking back over 41 years, I'm absolutely certain that we're not in the same place as we were when I started in education. But how do you promote that in a school? Where's the incentive for it?
Yes. Oh, well, one thing that, thank you very much, Anne. One thing that I think that you've raised for me is this idea about somehow having some consistent type of approach to intervention, because you're saying what a lot of commitment there needs to be staff training and stuff, and the idea that you might do one thing one year and something completely different the next year, and Chris's point that it took 3 years for the effect there, that's another kind of a point that to what extent do us researchers, have we got our heads around that, and anyway, that's the kind of point that I'm making. Any other let's hear from the other speakers. Any points that you would like to raise?
Or should I respond to some of those points?
Yeah, go for it, Chris.
Yeah, so the thing I underline, I suppose, is that curriculum interventions cannot often have effects, but they can be a bit patchy and they can sometimes be unsustained over time. Whereas whole school interventions, the evidence seems to suggest they take a while, but then the intervention effects are sustained. We found that, and also the Gatehouse projects in Australia found that. Maybe I should just say a little bit more about the mechanism of action, why we think it worked in those schools that built belonging. We think what was really key was students feeling part of decision making. The decisions the action groups made to make their school environments healthier in some ways might not have been as important as the way they made those decisions. So we got the action groups not just to involve the usual suspects, they weren't just the usual student council, middle class kids. We got them to involve naughty kids and working class kids. And there was a sense from the qualitative research that we did that was a major change in schools, and the students really appreciated it, and even the school students that weren't involved in the action groups knew that it was happening and felt differently. And it was about empathizing with teachers, as students realizing teachers were human beings, and teachers sort of realizing students were human beings, because they're in a more face-to-face collegial atmosphere rather than what can sometimes be a more tricky atmosphere of the classroom, is what came through interviews. And the reason why we thought that had a knock-on consequence for physical and mental health is that an awful lot of kids, they engage in risk behaviours such as drug use, etc., smoking, not because they don't know the knowledge to avoid that, but because they see it as a sort of way of defining their identity. it's easy for middle class kids in a way to have positive identities based on, you know, achievement and pro-social kinds of behaviours in school. And for the kids who maybe aren't doing so well academically or don't get such positive feedback from teachers, they seem to search out other ways to define themselves, which can often be in terms of risk behaviours. And the last point I suppose I'd make is just that the intervention, yeah, it really needed a fairly senior person, usually a deputy head, to run it. But that person didn't need to have any public health or health promotion skills or mental health skills for our intervention. It was about their managerial skills, and it was about, you know, for most schools, the curriculum wasn't very well delivered, and so the actual overt content about mental or physical health was very little. Mostly, it was about changing the school educational ethos, really, and social ethos. So, you know, what's interesting about our study is you can improve health without really addressing health.
Great, that's really interesting. And I'm wanting to move over now to the questions. I dropped the point you made, Anne, about research, which is really interesting. I'd like to pick that up later. Great. Oh, no. Okay. So Caroline Daly, it's not a priority to support. Is it not a priority to support teachers to teach brilliantly? There is such limited professional learning in many contexts, often limited to exam boards training. Restrictive curriculum pedagogical approaches impact on all learners in secondary schools, including the ones who succeed. Okay, so let's see what, I think this is a good general point about pedagogy. Yeah.
Our intervention didn't address teaching methods, although some schools did make local decisions to change teaching methods, you know, as part of the trial. I'm currently doing a systematic review, which is looking at the impact on health of interventions that do change teaching methods. So we might have some data on that later on, but I'm not a teacher and I can't further comment on it really.
I mean, it's clearly an important point if we're thinking about how teachers can have these consistent approaches and maybe sort of basic approaches. Yeah, let's see the questions again. Anybody else got a point they want to make on that?
I think that it does require a degree of courage on behalf of the school and certainly the management of the school. Schools are not great at sticking with things. We kind of look for the thing that's going to, first of all, have a quick fix and allow us to move on to the next thing. And I think the one thing I'm taking away from all of this is that you do have to have courage and you have to have faith and a belief that you do have the power to make a difference in these areas. And to do that, it has to be longitudinal. You need to very clearly, I suppose, map out, reflect, review, but keep it as a primary focus going on and persuading people that you may not see it today, but, you know, those year 7s coming in, when they're in year 11, then you'll see it, then you'll feel it. And that can be hard, I think, for schools, particularly with other pressures, particularly, I mean, I look at this sense of identity and belonging. I think it's so powerful and so important in a school. And you know, Ofsted judgments can quite seriously and significantly shift pupils' sense of pride and belonging in a school almost overnight. And then that's another thing that has to be addressed, how you keep those children feeling that it's worth belonging to the organisation that they're in.
I think that, okay, so I think that Caroline's point, and Caroline's involved with initial teacher education, might be that, you know, that these fundamental things need to be part of initial teacher education. And I think, again, Anne, you're raising the point in a way about the importance of then testing these things out actually within research in the school, because I suppose it's going to vary from one school to another exactly what might be effective. Oh, any other, we've got time for another question. Dan Clark. So if all schools have similar rates of mental health issues, does this imply that the problem is almost entirely systemic? Yeah,
so it might be that, so just to clarify, it isn't that all schools would necessarily have the same rates of mental health problems, but it seems to be, according to the research that's been reviewed so far, that the differences that do exist because there are differences in student characteristics more than differences in school level characteristics. So that might be simply because school environments don't vary that much. So that, the things that harm or benefit students' mental health in one school are pretty much the same in all schools. That's probably not the case, though, because other health outcomes do seem to be affected by school level factors. Although the school level effects on those outcomes, like drug use, violence, smoking and alcohol, they're not huge. They're significant, but they're not huge.
And I wonder if one of the issues about the research might be that in a school which is focusing on awareness and mental health, whereas you might get the subjective responses from pupils that they'll be more aware of their mental health issues.
Yeah, the observational studies, there were no interventions going on, so schools would vary the extent to which they were addressing mental health, I guess, but it's probably not a major factor.
Matthew, are you wanting to?
Yeah, I mean, just more widely off the back of that question, I think the sort of range of things which affect mental health issues, well-being, all of those sorts of outcomes is one of the reasons why, going back to one of your questions at the beginning, Jane, about should we focus on school performance, it's why I'm quite cautious about how we think about going about that, because of the range of factors and things which are outside of the school, and looking at what Chris has said about the difficulty of influencing some of those things is quite an important thing for us to think about from our policy perspective, about how we do want to see improvements, but how do you sort of bring that about? And I think it is, it's one of the reasons why we're very consciously focused on collaborative approaches, actually, in terms of some of the broader policy stuff that we're doing. And people have talked about, I think Anne talked about the mental health support teams coming in, that they sort of came after a program, link program, about bringing mental health services in schools closer together, because I do think there is some, and it's not just mental health services in schools, but there is something about actually how you do affect the range of things in children's lives, and get some sort of reinforcing going on. And I think one of the things that's come out of those sort of collaborative approaches, which will take time to establish, they're not we're deliberately sort of evaluating as we go along to try to create something that's sustained over the years in terms of a collaborative approach. But I think it is interesting about how, when you bring people together, there is that sort of how do we reinforce each other comes out of the sort of questions between the mental health services in schools, and some of the evaluation of link program showed services thinking about that, where previously they've probably been thinking about how do I make it a bit unfair, but not totally. How do I make, which bit of this is my problem, which bit of this is your problem in relation to the child? And I think also, both from the point of view of wider services thinking schools should be sorting things out, and schools having realistic expectations about how actually, where you do have a child who's got a mental health issue that needs referring on, how far that, securing a referral doesn't mean that has sorted it. Actually, it's still important to continue to support within the school environment, and it is a continued long-term sort of piece of work that wraps around. So I think, going back to that original question, I think it's why it's important that we have collaborative approaches and don't just try to isolate this down to what individual schools and people can do, and then try and isolate that out and push it.
Yeah, very good point. And I think a point that quite schools support quite strongly, that they feel that they do definitely need that link with mental health practitioners to come in and help and support. I suppose the implication, in a way, Dan, for me, of the question that you posed is, well, maybe it's not about schools. Maybe we don't need to bother about school environment, since everybody's mental health is similar across schools. But then you bring in Matthew's point about, well, if it's not schools, then we need the health professionals. Okay, I mean, I suppose I would say you got to think about how these kids are managing with their mental health problems in schools, and do we know enough about that? But anyway, let's move on now to I'm going to move on now to hear from Catherine Carroll. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak this morning. I'm going to start with a few questions. We've got actually 4 questions in a poll, so we'll need to be quick, and I probably won't wait for all the results to come up. It's a very rough and ready set of questions. Please don't check for internal fidelity or whatever, but I want to get a feel in the room of where I'm coming from really this morning, which is looking at stepping just a bit out again in terms of that relationship between research and practitioners. So the questions I've got, they're a mix. Some are for researchers, some are for practitioners. But if we could start the slide and have the first one up, please. And just, this is to researchers, this one. How many research projects are you currently involved that are taking place in a school? And although it may have been suspended by COVID, how many are in a school at the moment? Okay, so that gives us a fair idea. Thank you very much. 67% there, with 1 more than 311. But yeah, at least 64% of our researchers have 1 in a school at present. Okay, our next question, again, slight bias here, it's for our researchers. How many of the research projects entail delivery of a programme by a practitioner as opposed to bringing a member of the research team in? So in other words, you know, a teaching assistant, a teacher, how many are actually delivered by professionals in schools? Okay, so, you know, 40% for all, and then almost half. So again, you know, that's quite a high number, but we're asking professionals in schools to deliver. The next question, please. Now, like this last one for the researchers. How many of those projects involve a school practitioner, but now I want them, the question isn't working alongside you, it's during the whole research. In other words, they're more than the advisory group, more than we met you at the beginning for a couple of meetings, we'll meet you at the end to feedback. Okay, that's great actually, because look, we've got all that, you know, that is really positive to see, and actually I will say and put my cards on the table is certainly higher than I might have expected. So thank you for that. And now our last question for research for practitioners. Now, from your perspective, how many, not as a delivery, although that will come into it, but actually how far involved do you feel in the research, in the actual development of the research or in the process itself? Okay, at the moment I'm not aware of our split between researchers and practitioners in the room. It certainly was very heavily researchers at the beginning of the week, but there, you know, there's a figure there that might slightly different to the story we've got so far, but obviously we'll know all the reasons why for that. Okay, we have the next slide, sorry. Let me know if you're hearing too much feedback there. Okay, what I want to really talk about is when we look at the 3 areas, research, policy and practice. I suppose my background, many years a teacher, then researching and combining teaching, and then actually probably just more research now. I find myself more and more in what's been termed the brokerage space, which essentially today I'll probably just describe as a whole series of activities that in the end is trying to see the development of evidence informed, and I'm going to say decision making, which obviously leads to practice. And I also say, or you know, it said a brokerage space, because actually I'd probably argue that as researchers and practitioners, we move around in there. Sometimes we talk about a knowledge broker person, but actually I wonder if it's the activities in the space we should talk more about. And I also say evidence-informed decision making in the sense of to actually reflect that we probably automatically think of the setting. In this context today, we're talking about the school, but I wonder if that's also back to us as researchers and what is evidence-informed decision making, what we are seeing in schools and how that really reflects back on our practice as researchers. And so if we go to the next slide, I suppose, forgive me for slightly provocative title, which is we've had the title of the seminar, which is really Fixing a Child, Fixing the School. And I will pose here a little bit of fixing the research, if I may. And question one, really very quickly, I'll look at what is the evidence that we might need to fix, in inverted commas, the research. Question two, if yes, what might that look like, how we might go about it? And question three, what might we all do in the meantime? And all of them are just some examples that I'm aware of, have been involved in. In the room, there are many, many more examples of what I'm going to talk about. And it would be great if in the chat you could so we can have in one place and have in the publication after the event all the sorts of networks that are out there and activities that are going on that, with all the best will in the world, we can't all know that are happening. So if I go to the next slide, the first question really, just want to very quickly just point out there the points that were made in the paper that was shared before the session today, and that many of our speakers have already spoken about, and actually that you know, researchers working in the field and practitioners working in the field will know those gaps. So I'm not really going to pull on them, and please go back to the paper to see those in more detail. But the long-term studies, implementation, the fact that we haven't got enough perhaps in a UK setting. And actually, I'd just like to point out that in our area, we're not alone. So if we were looking here at literacy, if we were looking here at the teaching of maths and all sorts of other subjects, we'd probably find this wider context discussion, there'd be similarities. Next slide, please. So I suppose, you know, well, what might we do in this case if we see if we talk about fixing the research as a loose description? And so obviously there's addressing the gaps, which we've shown there in slide one. But I suppose I'd really, and it's kind of said today to a certain extent, it's coming up, but actually to really make a call for greater interdisciplinary research. In other words, who is round the table from beginning to end in our research teams? And you know, increasingly we understood perhaps that obviously interdisciplinary research may have more impact. This is not just in education now and in health, but across the board in sciences and in other research areas. And Okamura's paper recently, which was a review of many other studies, you know, there is this perhaps growing evidence that that paper certainly showed that for one extra discipline you add to round the table, there's potentially 20% more of an impact in your research. So I think there's growing evidence from a research perspective, but also where we come as practitioners in schools, a call for it. And the project that I have at the moment, a YEF one, looking at transition hubs in schools, actually it's a team of 11 around the table. I am the only researcher. You know, we are a group in a feasibility study of different practitioners and actually directors of education in local authorities and administrators and heads of other schools, and it is hard. And I'm very grateful to a team of external evaluators to support me in that. But actually, you can see even in the language where I might sit with colleagues around the table and, you know, what is the difference between a feasibility and a pilot outcomes and an RCT? And how do schools really get their heads around that? So yes, I think you know, a plea is for us to really think who that might be, and beyond the obvious. A second, or part three, then I hope would follow certainly my experiences at the moment in the project, but wider research would lead us to see that we would really understand the school context. And that's what I mean about, you know, child changes, school changes, but you know, what is it about research that needs to change? And to really address the things that are now common in our discussions. And we've heard them this morning, and we increasingly have heard them over 10, 15 years. So some very small examples, how schools operate. You know, if we, and actually the move this morning has been very much moving towards that, but, you know, the 10-week interventions twice a week are just really difficult for schools to deliver. On the whole, you know, this is as a big generalization, because the area that we're in will not be the only one a SENCO might have to manage in terms of the many 10-week interventions that take place in different areas. There's aligning, someone's already said it this morning, but there's the aligning of the very growing research we have about what makes good CPD in schools. And yes, as Anne's pointed out, it's far from perfect, but we have got now very good kind of principles of what that looks like. Regular, often, for example. And what I suppose I would say there is, when we bring an intervention in, I wonder how much we do that in school in a way that is also cognizant of just how we do school improvement, and that very big focus in that area in schools, and all the research literature around school improvement. And because essentially with an intervention, that's what we're doing. We're trying to improve what we offer. And then the curriculum's been talked about a lot this morning, and would fully agree. But I wonder sometimes if, and it has happened, and it would be good to hear some examples. Can we start with what the curriculum actually is, and the therapeutic potential, for example, of many aspects of the English curriculum? Just as a start, you know, I'm not expert in all subjects. My area is humanities, actually. But to really look at what we have already, and often I'm guilty of it myself sometimes, which is, you know, devising a really good, devising an SEL intervention, for example, and, you know, having a fairly good understanding of PSHE, and think, well, that would be really great as part of a PSHE curriculum in school, not knowing that actually as teachers many demands are coming on PSHE, including, for example, you know, all sorts of things, a 10-week program on how to spend your money wisely. So that's, you know, that's kind of the experience. And then finally, the demand on resources, Barrett and colleagues have just published a paper. It was a look at a maths intervention, but they also bring in social and emotional and mental health. And they followed one maths intervention to really look at the costs and the financial costs of those demand on resources. So the actual maths program itself, the content and materials were nearly $4,000. But in the end, when you took all the necessary pre-meetings, all the necessary meetings through, when you took the cost of training, and then when you took the cost of post-completion and meetings and demands on the school and researcher, that intervention was $50,000. So quite often that's a school experience where sometimes the costs are just prohibitive anyway. And then there's a real lack of awareness of actually the hidden costs of research projects. And schools are welcoming if they just know. It's a kind of having a knowledge of that. Next slide, please. So what do we do in the meantime as researchers and practitioners? Well, you know, we do our good work, and we've heard much of it this morning, and it will carry on. And in fact, if I think about nationally, and we look at the list there, and it's really not exhaustive, but in the last 10 years, certainly as practitioners and researchers, we are building the go-to sources to help us in that work. But it takes time, I suppose, and the question is, you know, what can we do in the meantime? But that's what we have. But what we can do, in some examples of work that I've just been involved in, but from other areas, is sustained regional groups establishing themselves. So one, for example, and excuse the London-centric nature of it, but the Pan-London Autism Schools Network, which nearly, well, 8 years ago was a group of special schools around London for young people with autism and profound learning difficulties and severe learning difficulties who set themselves up because they needed it. And then from that, a research group of researchers in autism and the practitioners developed, and that's still running. So please look at that network. And then finally, research boards. 2 examples there where schools are setting up themselves a research board to help them make sense of all the research that's out there, to help them make meaning from the good work that they see in their setting, and particularly where they're inundated for requests from research. And there are many specialist settings which are, that's one of the reasons I'm on, too many requests come, and actually how can you reduce resources on a school? So really those are, just if we go to the last slide, just some references there, but really my points this morning to open up the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And now, so that's brought us nicely round to the issues about, in a sense, how we implement all these lovely ideas. Matthew and Anne, which one of you would like to go first?
Matthew, do you want to?
Oh, hello, Anne. We can
Hello. I've changed machine.
Anne, go ahead, I think.
Okay. In that case, I thought 3 or 4 things that I'd like to just pick up in things that Catherine's made. It was funny actually when she started to speak about cost, because it was the thing I was thinking about. We have quite a lot of money comes into schools, particularly a school like mine with 40% EAL and 40% pupil premium. And I was thinking about how this money is spent. And one of the things we found with interventions is how difficult it is to measure any impact. It's quite hard. So there's an act of hope in so much of what gets done. You hope it will make a difference. You hope it will be the thing. But clearly it isn't, if you like, particularly helpful, the 10 weeks being taken out at break time. I noticed one of the questions is about that. I mean, students will actually see it as invasive rather than helpful if that's the way it's done. I think the cost aspect of it is quite important, because we wouldn't, if you like, spend money in that way in normal, if it was talking about maths or talking about English or talking about those things, but we do tend to, with this extra money, this other money that comes in. And I do think that should be one of our incentives about how we interrogate now the wider curriculum, how we interrogate what that should include. So much of what I've read about, kind of in preparation for this roundtable, has been that it doesn't impact on attainment and necessarily, or that causality is not really proven. But do we have then, in terms of our curriculum, a wider remit as schools? And we can't, I just don't feel that somebody said, you know, in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of kids queuing up at food banks, you know, why are we talking about this? But we can't be defeatist. We have to believe that we make a difference. We have to have that faith, and we have to have that courage to say, actually, this is something that matters to us. And in particular communities, I think that it really does matter. Another person raised the question about how you engage parents in this. And I think that is absolutely fundamental. Some schools can make parents feel pretty impotent about first of all, their engagement with the school, but also the impact that they can have on their children's lives. And part of what we need to be doing, I think, as part of our curriculum, is also supporting them in working with us to make a difference to these children's lives. But I do think that it's quite hard for us to do it without some framework. And I think what the researchers do is provide us with a framework in which we can trial some of those. You asked about what we can do in the meantime. Well, you know, we all struggle blindly, I suppose. But if we're very clear about what our destination is in some of these things, we can at least start that journey, and it will have an impact both on the teachers and on the children. And I think if I come back to this word, you know, faith, we have to have some faith that we will be making a difference and it will change things. Because what's the alternative? What's the alternative? I don't understand how we can, as educators, think that we can just go on as we are.
Thank you, Anne. Matthew.
All I'd add to that is, I mean, just going back to some of the randomised controlled trials that Jess was talking about, you know, that we've been very conscious of that actually there has been a tendency towards very heavy level sort of interventions and testing those in the schools and not necessarily think about how they would apply or whether or not they're applicable in a school basis. And that's one of the things, you know, one of the reasons that we set the RCTs program that Jess talked about up in the way that we did, you know, with actually the second bit about, you know, relatively small scale sort of interventions in terms of promoting well-being, because that's how schools were doing them. And it wasn't because that's not because necessarily we think, oh yeah, you should be able to just knock these things off in 5 minutes and that sort of thing. We wanted to test all the sorts of approaches that schools take, how they take the things that are there and then adapt them. Do they actually work, or do you actually have to put yourself into, you know, does it require that full sort of implementation? I think Chris was talking about restorative approaches to behaviour and things like that, and we know from sort of talking to schools and the work around anti-bullying and things like that, that you've got to do those properly, and it does, as Chris was talking about, have to sort of fit within the whole school and be sort of adopted if it's going to, you know, if those sorts of things are going to work. So I think it's important for us to understand that, and it's important that as we sort of pick up the practice, that we are getting that sort of sense of, is this realistically something that a school can do, and are we testing that, and how does that sort of work? And I think it comes back then to actually getting that more understanding between the health and and education about what the context is like, and you know that you're not necessarily looking at the school as a public health setting where you would do a public health sort of intervention. You're looking at it, you know, it is a school. There are things you can do which will benefit, and you know, in terms of the knock-on effects. You know, while some of the links between attainment and things like that, the evidence is still sort of developing. You know, part of it is about making schools a place that kids can come to, where they're happy to come to, pushing up attendance, getting that sort of thing in place, I think, which is really important. So yeah, I think those sort of questions are important to us, and that sort of understanding of the context and that it's not a health context is really, really important.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew. Now we're going over to questions. Let's see. We've got one from Natalie Rothwell-Warren. It is interesting that it's assumed that it is pupils and schools that need fixing, and not, arguably, the political agenda that has put pupils and schools in this position. Would you agree? Are we afraid to talk about this? Anybody want to have a go at that one?
I can tell you anecdotally something.
Go on.
Okay. The school I'm in at the moment had full roles for however many years and was graded outstanding. The work that it was doing was presumably seen and perceived by the outside world as being kind of okay. It was then graded RI, and this year
tell everybody what RI is.
Requires improvement, and the next year of admissions, the school's admissions dropped quite dramatically. Now, one has to maybe argue all sorts of causality in that, but it did seem a pretty profound causality that suddenly the outside perception of the school, despite the fact that it hadn't greatly altered, because presumably it was operating in the RI requires improvement category when it was getting some of those full year groups, but overnight that made a difference, particularly against a background of published data which showed the school as being the only RI school in an area. So I think you'd be mad not to say that it has an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Other takes on this question, Chris?
Yeah, I could come in. So I think it's really important that I don't think the context of schooling is going to change anytime soon. You know, I think there's metrics of performance and school league tables are here to stay. But I think different schools respond to that in different ways, and some are more healthy than others. I think it's absolutely pivotal, you know, our research and other research has shown, for kids to feel a sense of belonging in a school community.
Yeah, that's absolutely it.
And one way of doing that is to, you know, have them more actively involved in decision making, because, you know, a massive surprise, students are human beings, and human beings, you know, we know from, I know I've done some research on my own children and found they are human, and you know, we know from the, you know, studies of work that people are happier at work if they've got a sense of control over their work. And why would it be any different for kids? So I think one thing is about participation, decision making. But I think there's another thing, and this is purely anecdotal from me, you know, working in schools and having kids at schools. Some schools, I think, are really good at building a sense of a collective experience, ethos, and meaning. And some schools are more, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, although I think it has negative consequences, that they're more focused on doing the best for each child as an individual. So they're almost like factories of individuals achieving their potential. And I think there is a risk in just taking that more sort of individualistic approach to realising potential. And schools also have to have a collective overall culture. It's easy for me to say that because I don't run a school, but, you know, that's my observation.
Okay, I'm just going to see if there's any other questions I ought to pick up here. I'm just conscious. Right, we've got John McMullen. Do speakers think we engage enough with systematic societal issues that cause mental ill health? Important discussion today, but interventions can feel like sticking plaster when kids are queuing up at food banks and so on. So it's a wee bit similar to the previous question.
Yeah, I mean, Anne did address that earlier on, and I suppose I would agree that, you know, do we just wait in time? We can't, you know, we can't wait. We have who we have in front of us as well in terms of who we support tomorrow in schools, and I'm not sure that is a one or the other. Forgive me if I've misunderstood the question; it's disappeared. But it's a one or the other approach, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's, in other words, it's not an either or, is it? You know,
yeah.
You should be addressing that there'll be tough stuff going on outside. I think that's what Chris was saying too. But that doesn't mean to say we wait for that to get fixed before we touch anything in the school. That doesn't seem to me a sensible approach.
Yeah, Jane, can I just bring a couple of things that were said earlier? One was about parents, and yes, that, you know, there isn't, you know, we need more research that includes parents in school, but we actually also need more research which includes parent voice in the type of research. Now, we are beginning to see that collected in different areas, but even in a local setting, a school research board would have young people on there, parents and carers on there, as well as the teachers, actually directing the research to, okay, this is the research that we have, what best suits our context, and a voice in what research they participate in.
Yeah.
And then the other one was impact. That is the difficulties that, you know, we have in research, maybe to investigate that, but certainly, as Anne said, in schools, in terms of the myriad of interventions that go on in some settings, and just our work in the classroom, that, you know, how do we measure impact? What does it look like? How do we link that up to any kind of top level indicators that we might have is a huge task, particularly, for example, Senkos who have that role, and other senior leaders connected with demonstrating impact in schools. And again, that's where I think the strength of researchers and practitioners actually in the building on not just a project, but on just generally as professionals working together, that researchers can offer that support on looking at impact and how to gather that.
Yeah, no, I think both very important points, and that thread about both of them kind of threading through. Okay, I'm being pushed along. We're nearly out of time, guys. Now I'm going. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to put up some proposals, and I want you now to vote on whether you agree or disagree or whatever with these statements. So this is sort of trying to understand to what extent you agree with the position paper, to what extent you don't, following all this discussion. Okay, so can we see the first question, please? So there you are. Every school should have a policy for Tier 1 and Tier 2 approaches to student well-being and mental health. Okay, well, we all agree on that one. Very good. Second question, please. This should include evidence-informed approaches, both to developing students' SEL and resilience to stress. So we're saying it should have this idea of well-being, that should be in the school policy, and we've got 100% agreement on that. And that it should be evidence-informed, which is interesting because it probably isn't at the moment. Right, next slide. Next question. Whole school approach to ensure consistent, sustainable structures. We're more divided here. Right, so there's some doubt about whether or not we should have whole school approaches, which again is consistent with the research evidence. It's a bit not sure there. We propose that they're important, but some of you don't think so. Okay, good. Next question. Okay, there's pretty good agreement here, but not entire agreement that the research community is not well aligned with practical applications, which again probably it reflects the diversity of the research community and what it's up to. So quite a lot will not necessarily be thinking about practical applications to address student well-being and mental health, but some will be. Okay, next one. Education and mental health professionals should work more closely to exchange expertise. Now, everybody's agreeing with these things. I mean, it's a bit like whether or not you think apple pie is a good idea, all of these things. But the fact of the matter is we're not doing these things very well in some cases. So how are we going to get there? Right, next one. So there should be a more explicit focus on school performance in relation to well-being and mental health. So this is quite situated within the education perspective, although they might need support. Now we've got about 3/4 of you are buying into that. About 4/5 now. Okay, and some of you not. So there's some people who are thinking, no, we don't need that. That's interesting too. And the last one. Right, now note that the question says should substantially address well-being and mental health, and I don't think that's true at the moment. I think we might see it. Okay, great. Now I'm going to go over now to discussion and questions. I wonder if I'm going to reach out to Caroline Daly, who I'm hoping is still there, who has to do with ITE, and whether she thinks that it's represented. Anne, you want to say something though? Fantastic. Yes, Anne.
I didn't want to say anything. I'm sorry.
Oh, all right. You don't need to. You don't need to.
I'm perhaps right at the end. I mean, what I feel is that the questions obviously most people are going to be committed to those, because who wouldn't be? I think there's kind of the gap between that and the methodology that we can use to get there. But maybe we have to start the thinking in order to make some of it happen.
It's how do we get it's exactly, we're all agreed more or less, not entirely, but we're very far away from reaching that. Okay, let's see the points that are being made by the audience. Is that possible, Vera, folks? I'm not quite sure where we're up to with that, discussions and questions. Catherine, how can we get understanding of mental health built into initial teacher education? Yes, so Professor Ford shows teachers accurately identify children who are mentally healthy, and also ID children and young people whose mental health is poorer than average. I'm not quite sure of the second point you're making, Catherine, there. But how can we get an understanding of mental health built into initial teacher training? What about joint collaborative training from Catherine? CPD for leaders in local national health sector and education school leaders, focus on joining systems working hand in hand. Yes, that it chimes very well with our sense that from the paper that there needs to be closer working. I will say, guys, I'm going to pick up John McMullen's question in a second. I think that we're going to have a blog afterwards, and it would be great for people to be feeding into the blog to give some solutions so that we could then feed them into the final version of the position paper. So John McMullen, do speakers think we engage enough with systemic societal issues that cause mental ill health? Important discussion today, but interventions can feel like a sticking plaster. Yes, so that is that was the one that you raised similarly after Catherine's talk, John. And then, is there enough representation from minority groups and those from low backgrounds in these discussions? That's a good point. And I think,
Absolutely.
Yeah, somebody was speaking there, Matthew, or I don't know whom.
I said absolutely. I think it's absolutely critical. And we have to work hard now to make sure that these kind of discussions are reflective of the whole breadth of the society in which our children operate.
And Chris, you were making that point about your intervention, where you were structuring things so that you would get pupil voice, not just from the usual suspects.
Yeah, we thought it was really important to do. It was quite a difficult thing to ask schools to do without putting it in sort of stigmatizing or derogatory terms. And some schools went slightly overboard and had way too many students and sometimes way too many naughty students, and it slightly capsized the action groups, but generally worked well.
Yeah, and some research that I've done with colleagues recently shows that when we were working in secondary with children who were identified as having social, emotional, and mental health needs, that they were not, and children with mild learning difficulties, they were never represented in these councils. Yeah. Okay, back to the questions. Oh, Matthew, sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, just to come in on off the back of a few of those, I think going back, I mean, it is really important that we think about the wider determinants of mental health, and this is, the schools are not in isolation. I think it's really important on government and something working together, Department of Health and other government departments, about how do you also tackle those other sort of determinants so that this is not sat alone. I think within DFE as well, in terms of some of the things that people have been talking about in the comments, one of the things that clearly we aim to do is that actually getting that good educational background and that good sort of opportunity and achieving is really important to longer term mental health, longer term attainment and that sort of thing. And obviously we try and set up a system to try and equalize that. Now, some people have talked about how different schools interpret that in different ways, and I think there is more that we can do within DFE and how we sort of go through things to make sure that what we're trying to measure and the improvements we're trying to measure don't skew the system. Just take a small example. One of the things that falls within my remit is anti-bullying, and sort of trying to work with Ofsted and get messages across when say that when they're looking at bullying in schools, that when they're going in, what they expect to see is schools acknowledging bullying and tackling it, to have a process in place. They're not just going to go in and say, oh, you don't have any bullying. That constitutes a sort of good result, and I think that is an example of the sort of thing which I think we do need to make sure that we're picking up and working on as we go through. In relation to teacher training and things like that, as people say, that we do have quite a diverse initial teacher training set up, and it is something for us to look at about how much things like mental health and wellbeing run through in the context of teachers understanding their job, really. But as other people have pointed out, I think it is sort of our own experience, having been through initial teacher training. You can only do so much in ITT. The two things which are really important in the context of that. One is ongoing CPD and making sure that is there, and I think that's one of the things that in putting together the training for senior mental health leads, and what we're looking at is, part of that is how do you support that ongoing CPD within the school. And I think it is really important as well within this teacher education that it's one thing to sort of have it nominate in the course, but it's really important the school in which you're in and how that sort of operates, sort of from my experience, in terms of what you can actually do, and putting that learning into practice is really important. So then you do sort of come back round to having the commitment in leadership and how that's set up within a whole school environment in order to make it stick, rather than just thinking about what happens to be in the course. I think it all does need to knit together.
So that's a very good point about policy, about the potential for these mental health leads and how they can be spearheading the continuing professional development. I'm just conscious we're now going out of time, so I'm just picking up on a couple of the top points there by Lou Norman. Yes, absolutely. I think that there should be specific professionals trained in mental health that should come into school for the kids that have mental health difficulties. The research evidence we mention in our paper is pointing to that being a good strategy. It's also kind of being managed systemically through, in England, these mental health support teams from the health side. Picking up Professor David Egan's point, very interesting to hear about your idea in Wales, Professor Egan, and that does seem to chime with the notion of having a more rounded curriculum basis, in a sense, to this sort of fitting it into schools. Now, we have now, Anne, are you raising your hand or just?
No.
Very good. Okay, people in the, we are now at 12:31. We've overshot our time. It's been brilliant sharing ideas with you all. And I think that we are going to have a blog that's going up. I'm not sure if Marie can thank you very much to the discussants and the speakers for giving us your valuable time, and to the audience for hanging out with us and sharing your ideas. And I'm hoping that we can share some more ideas with the blog and get back to continue this discussion.